Yet another random video from me that probably no one's interested in, but I am. The more I watch the reaction to the Quinn Hughes departure from the Vancouver Canucks to move to the Minnesota Wild, the more I realize that people are not actually talking about leadership or loyalty or what it means to be a captain of a hockey team. They're actually talking about their own expectations, and I think that those expectations are extremely unrealistic and very hypocritical. This video is a companion piece to the one I did about Connor McDavid a while back. That video wasn't really about contracts or cap hits either. It was about how uncomfortable people become when an elite player makes a choice that doesn't fit the story that they want them to tell. In that video, I was talking about how Connor McDavid, captain of the Edmonton Oilers, chose to stay, albeit only for 2 years, but most significantly signed what many regarded as an undervalued contract for a player of his caliber. He was called selfish by many for doing that. When Hughes left the Canucks this week, he's also being called selfish by a lot of people. And at some point, we have to admit that the problem isn't the players. A lot of the criticism aimed at Quinn Hughes hinges on one word: captain. He was the captain of the Canucks. Leaders aren't supposed to leave. Captains are supposed to stay and fix things. And that sounds noble until you ask a very basic question. What power do people actually think that an NHL captain has? Because there is a very massive gap between symbolic authority and real authority, and fans constantly conflate the two. An NHL captain has influence in the locker room. They set tone, they manage relationships, they absorb pressure, they speak to the media, and they hold teammates to account. That is responsibility. What they don't have is organizational power. They don't hire or fire coaches. They don't control drafting. They don't decide roster constructions. They don't determine development strategy. They don't set ownership priorities. They do not control how money is spent. And they do not get veto rights over trades, including their own. Players like Quinn Hughes might have a degree of say in where they go, simply because they are very talented and sought after, but captains do not have inherent power. A captain is a leader amongst players. They are not part of the management of a club. The part that people don't seem to understand or like to hear is that in the NHL, captains are still assets. They are highly visible assets and emotionally resonant assets, but they are still just assets. If you want proof of that, you don't have to look very far. Look at Brad Marchand. He was a franchise player, a long-serving member of the Boston Bruins. He was the captain. He was deeply tied to team identity. But when the organization decided that they were unable to reach a deal in relation to his contract and a trade made sense, he was moved on. They were regretful. He cried a lot. No amount of leadership capital stopped the move. It wasn't an insult to Marchand, and it's not even a criticism of Boston. It's just how the NHL works. Teams make decisions based on cap efficiency, competitive windows, and asset value. They will do it without sentiment when sentiment conflicts with profit or performance, which makes the expectation placed on Quinn Hughes completely unbalanced. When fans say that Hughes should have stayed with the Canucks because he was the captain, what they're really saying is that he should have stayed and fixed a failing system from a position which had no structural power. That's not leadership, that's fantasy. Captains can't fix ownership issues. They can't fix poor management. They can't fix bad drafting or systemic organizational failure. Expecting one player to remain loyal to a situation that is visibly dysfunctional simply because he wears a letter is asking him to absorb responsibility without agency. And I think that that's an unreasonable expectation in any workplace. The part that really bothers me is about how the criticism is framed. There's an implication floating around that because Quinn Hughes was the captain, he should have stayed until the team was successful, full stop, as if leaving earlier meant that automatically he didn't try hard enough. But that doesn't line up with reality. He didn't arrive in Vancouver, see a bit of instability, and immediately look for the exit. He stayed, he developed there. He became the on ice engine of the team. Everybody knew that he was the one carrying the team on his shoulders. He accepted the captaincy in the middle of organisational uncertainty, not after things were already working. He was probably too young to be the captain, but he took on the responsibility anyway. I don't see that as the behaviour of someone who's avoiding difficulty. I, of course, wasn't there and have no idea what actually happened, but from the outside looking in, it's hard not to conclude that he did try to make things better, and then at some point he must have realised the limits of what he could actually change as a player. I think that there's a difference between quitting when things get hard and recognising that you are trapped inside structural problems that you do not control. Hughes didn't leave because the job was challenging. He left because continuing to carry responsibility without agency was no longer sustainable. Some fans frame his departure as selfish in a much darker way. The idea seems to be that by leaving, he's somehow making things worse for everyone else in his team, that he's abandoning his teammates, and that he's dooming them by stepping away. There's a real world analogy sometimes people reach here whether they realise it or not. I remember a while back there was a hot air balloon accident in China where the balloon caught fire while it was relatively low to the ground. The first person who jumped had a chance of surviving because the balloon hadn't risen too high yet. But once that person jumped, the balloon shot upward and anyone left inside was doomed. If they jumped later, they would die. If they stayed, they would die. People are acting like Quinn Hughes leaving the Canucks is a betrayal, like jumping out of the hot air balloon first is evil. But if you think about what that analogy actually implies, and if you follow it through properly, you'll see that it's not really correct. The person who jumped didn't start the fire. They didn't design the balloon. They didn't control the fuel, the wind, or the physics. They were simply reacting to a situation that had already become lethal. Crucially, there is no version of that story where the person who jumps can somehow save everyone else by staying. They also can't tell everyone to jump at once. That isn't how physics works, and it isn't how contracts work either. Quinn Hughes couldn't have coordinated a mass exit even if he wanted to. Players are bound by individual contracts. Actively encouraging teammates to revolt would not be leadership. It would be interference with contractual relations. It would be unprofessional and likely unlawful. So the idea that he was selfish for not sacrificing himself, or for not somehow dragging everyone else out with him, collapses under even minimal scrutiny. Leaving does not cause the system to fail. It exposes that the system had already reached a point where staying meant absorbing damage for problems you did not create and could not fix. When I read about the fans criticising him for leaving, there's such a workplace double standard. There is so much hypocrisy amongst the fans. I know so many people who have told me that if they ever won the lottery, they would just walk out of their job immediately. No handover, no notice, no sense of obligation at all. All of them say it with great pride. Yet I bet these are the same sorts of people who will turn around and condemn someone like Quinn Hughes for leaving a workplace where he was unhappy, the culture was poor, and his team was losing and had no prospects of success. In normal life, we call leaving a bad job self-preservation. In elite sport, we call it betrayal. I'm not quite sure why, except that perhaps athletes aren't treated as workers or even human beings, they're just symbols. So there's really a no-win standard here. What McDavid and Hughes both reveal is the same impossible standard. If you stay, you're selfish for taking too much or not taking enough. In other words, you're making it harder for other top NHL players who want to demand a big contract. There were people saying that GMs might say to their star players, hey, if McDavid's taking a haircut for the team so they can have a better chance at winning the cup, why aren't you? And here we've got people saying if you leave when things are bad, you're selfish for choosing yourself. It seems like once someone becomes exceptional, neutrality disappears and every choice is moralized. The thing is, if teams are allowed to act ruthlessly in their own self-interests, then players should be allowed to act rationally in theirs. You can't call it a business only when it suits you. As I said, being the captain doesn't make you powerful. It only makes you visible. It makes you the face of decisions you didn't make. It makes you the emotional buffer between fans and management. And when things go wrong, it makes you the easiest target. So Quinn Hughes didn't fail a city by leaving. The city failed to reckon honestly with what power he actually had. So Connor McDavid chose to stay, and he was punished and criticised for restraint. Quinn Hughes chose to leave and was punished for autonomy. But both cases expose the same truth. Fans are deeply uncomfortable when elite players remind us that they still have choice, especially when that choice disrupts the stories we want to tell about loyalty, leadership, and sacrifice. Captains aren't kings, they're just employees with a letter on their chest. And so until fans recognize that, they're going to keep blaming the wrong people. So I'm glad that Quinn Hughes had the courage and strength of mind to do something about his unhappy situation. He certainly looks a lot happier now with the Minnesota Wild.